In the year 1700, India accounted for nearly a quarter of the global economy. It stood as a vibrant hub of international trade, renowned for its wealth of gold, silk, and spices, exporting fine cotton textiles and precious gems across all continents. The cities of this magnificent land were illuminated by the brilliance of craftsmanship and bustling commerce. Bengal alone boasted greater riches than all of Britain combined. However, by the time India achieved its independence in 1947, its share of the world economy had plummeted to under 4%. This drastic change did not occur spontaneously. It was engineered through systematic domination. The invasion was not solely militaristic. It was accompanied by financial instruments, taxation policies, and commercial laws that reshaped the landscape. Welcome to the intricate world where finance intersects with power and history, a realm where nothing is as straightforward as it appears. Over 2 centuries, the British Empire crafted one of history's most efficient resource extraction systems. Their influence in India went beyond mere governance. They effectively monetized the land. They transformed a civilization that once exported luxury goods to Rome, Arabia, and China into a supplier of inexpensive raw materials for British industry. This transformation was driven by a silent revolution in accounting practices. For the British Parliament, these profits were nothing short of staggering. The dividends from the East India Company soared to unprecedented heights. Stock prices in London skyrocketed as investors who had never set foot in Asia grew wealthy off Indian tax revenues. Yet, these same taxes were exacted from farmers who struggled to feed themselves and their families. The company evolved into an entity unlike anything ever seen before. A private empire with its own currency, military force, and judicial system. Its leaders sat comfortably in lavish boardrooms back in London, while agents in India oversaw forced labor operations, monopolized trade routes, and systematically crushed local industries under the guise of promoting a free market. This was not merely theft. It constituted a systematic transfer of wealth on an epic scale. When famine struck Bengal in 1770, one of history's deadliest famines, it claimed approximately 10 million lives. Despite roads strewn with corpses, the company's revenues continued to rise unabated. They persisted in collecting taxes relentlessly while simultaneously exporting grain out of India. For investors back in London, it turned out to be a remarkably profitable year. The concept of market efficiency had supplanted any notion of compassion or human decency. Meanwhile, British economists at home rationalized these actions as part of a greater mission for civilization. They proclaimed that India was backward and that Britain was there to modernize it, constructing railways, instituting laws, and disseminating English education. However, each so-called improvement was meticulously crafted not for altruistic purposes but rather for maximizing profit margins. The narrative spun by these economists concealed the harsh reality faced by millions whose lives were irrevocably altered by this relentless exploitation disguised as progress. This stark contrast between prosperity in London and suffering in Bengal painted a vivid picture of how corporate interests overshadowed ethical considerations during this tumultuous period in history. As wealth flowed into the coffers of a few privileged individuals and institutions back home, whole populations languished under oppressive taxation without any means for survival or dignity left intact. The railway networks were not established to foster connectivity among the Indian populace. Rather, their primary function was to link cotton plantations with bustling ports. Educational institutions did not aim to cultivate a burgeoning middle class. Instead, they served to train clerks for colonial bureaucracies. Judicial systems failed to uphold rights. They primarily enforced debt repayments. Even the railways, often idealized as a benevolent gift from the empire, were financed in ways that ensured British profits remained intact. Investors in Britain were promised returns of 5%, guaranteed by Indian taxpayers, regardless of the operational efficacy of these railroads. The profits flowed steadily back to London, while the financial burdens were borne by Calcutta. This financial structure resembled a vampiric system, extracting wealth without shedding blood. This mechanism became so efficient that it earned a specific title, wealth drain. The Indian intellectual Dadabhai Naoroji, in his seminal work published in 1901 titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, described this phenomenon as India's bleeding, a relentless outflow of resources, labor, and capital towards Britain with no reciprocal advantages for the Indian people. He estimated that by the close of the 19th century, India was losing hundreds of millions of pounds annually, wealth that underpinned Britain's industrial revolution and financed imperial military endeavors. His assertions were validated by historians who calculated that between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted from India an amount equivalent to $45 trillion today. This staggering figure eclipses the combined gross domestic product of both the United States and China in contemporary times. However, the repercussions extended beyond mere economics. They resonated deeply within human lives. For centuries, India had been a hub for exporting high-quality goods while importing precious metals. Under British dominion, this dynamic dramatically shifted. Instead of valuable exports, India began sending raw cotton, opium, and grains overseas, while flooding its markets with finished British products. Artisans, weavers, and traders who once formed the backbone of a thriving luxury economy found themselves decimated by these policies. British textiles inundated Indian markets at prices local craftsmen could never match. Entire cities renowned for their weaving traditions and fabric production, like Dhaka, fell into decline and disrepair. By the mid-19th century, India had transformed from being the world's largest textile producer into merely a supplier of raw cotton for Manchester's factories. This was globalization in its 19th century form, a process that turned India into a source of raw materials fueling Britain's industrial ascent and relegated it to the role of an oppressed consumer of foreign goods. This narrative is not about nationalism or revenge. It is fundamentally about mathematics, the numbers behind how one of the wealthiest societies on Earth descended into poverty, not through warfare but through calculated financial manipulation. To truly grasp this story, one must begin at its origins, long before the Union Jack flew over Delhi. This transformation altered not just economic landscapes but also cultural identities as communities grappled with loss and adaptation amid changing circumstances. As British industry thrived on Indian resources, local economies struggled to survive under an increasingly exploitative regime that prioritized profit over people. In this complex interplay between empire and colony, countless lives were irrevocably altered, the legacies of which continue to echo through history today. Even at the height of British officials' boasts about modernization, the per capita income in India stagnated for nearly 2 centuries. Famine became a more frequent occurrence. Wages plummeted, yet the empire continued to amass wealth. This was not a mere coincidence. It constituted a deliberate business model. Throughout history, every empire has exacted tribute, but the British discovered a way to disguise this tribute as trade. By the 19th century, the East India Company had been replaced by direct rule from the Crown following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Nevertheless, the financial mechanisms that enabled exploitation remained untouched. The Raj no longer relied solely on territorial conquests. It wielded something far more powerful: contracts. Indian revenues underwrote British military campaigns in Afghanistan, funded pensions for British officials, and even paid colonial officers stationed in Africa. The financial burdens of maintaining an empire were shifted onto those who were colonized, creating what could be termed as a millennium deal for Britain. In essence, India was financing its own conquerors. As the 19th century drew to a close, this system evolved into an even more sophisticated framework, one of financial imperialism so intricate that it hardly resembled traditional exploitation. It masqueraded as governance. The British Raj refined the concept of internal levies, which referred to payments that India was obligated to make annually to Britain in exchange for services rendered. These payments covered everything from salaries for British bureaucrats in India to interest on loans secured in London for railroads and infrastructure projects. Additionally, pensions for retired civil servants and expenses related to maintaining a British military presence were also included in these costs. While theoretically framed as administrative expenditures, they represented an elegant accounting trick designed to siphon off wealth from India. Each year, vast amounts of money left the country without any corresponding influx of goods or services. There was no barter taking place. There were no services being rendered. This represented a pure financial outflow, a colonial balance that drained value while leaving widespread poverty in its wake. By the turn of the 20th century, these transfers had escalated beyond £100 million annually, equivalent to tens of billions of dollars today. Economists have estimated that over 2 centuries, the empire extracted what would now amount to $45 trillion from India. This staggering figure seems almost implausible due to its enormity, yet its effects are omnipresent. Once a flourishing economy built upon artisans and traders, India's economic landscape transformed into one burdened by debt-ridden agricultural communities. Meanwhile, industrial cities across Britain, Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool were constructed on profits derived from Indian raw materials. The transformation was stark. Vibrant markets once brimming with goods became shadows of their former selves as wealth flowed out rather than being reinvested back into local economies. The legacy of this extraction created lasting scars on India's socio-economic fabric and continues to resonate through history today. The textile mills of Lancashire gleamed throughout the night, their operations thriving, as the Indian weaving looms fell silent. For the British Parliament, this represented a significant advancement. However, for India, it marked the onset of deindustrialization. The textile industry was merely one among several sectors that suffered catastrophic declines. Shipbuilding, metallurgy, and woodworking in India deteriorated under oppressive British policies. Vast stretches of Indian forests were cleared to produce railway sleepers. Farmers found themselves compelled to cultivate cash crops like indigo and opium, which served Britain's external trade interests rather than ensuring food security for their own nation. When drought struck, the consequences were dire and far-reaching. Between 1876 and 1902, a series of devastating famines swept across the subcontinent, claiming the lives of more than 20 million people. During this same period, India exported millions of tons of grain to Britain. Grain that could have sustained the starving populace was shipped abroad because profits from exports took precedence over human lives. A British official by the name of Sir Richard Temple even argued against providing aid to those suffering from hunger, claiming it would distort the market. To him, markets became the ultimate measure of morality. Yet perhaps the most striking and sinister aspect of this system was how it exploited India's own financial resources to maintain imperial ambitions. When British forces engaged in military campaigns in Afghanistan, Burma, or Africa, bills were frequently settled with revenues collected in India. This meant that India was not merely a colony. It had transformed into the empire's central bank. Indian soldiers fought valiantly on various fronts, from Sudan to Singapore, only to have their wages deducted from taxes paid by Indian citizens. At the dawn of the 17th century, India was under the dominion of the Mughal Empire. This vast and sophisticated civilization comprised nearly 150 million inhabitants, around a quarter of the world's population at that time. The Mughals governed a thriving agricultural sector, supported by advanced irrigation techniques and bustling ports that facilitated extensive trade networks. Indian textiles were so highly prized that European merchants embarked on long voyages lasting several months to acquire mere rolls of cotton fabric. Spices such as pepper, indigo dye, and silk flowed abundantly through the ports of Surat and Calcutta. British infrastructure projects around the globe were funded through Indian capital. The empire thrived on Indian rupees while villages across India languished in poverty due to a severe shortage of currency. While Indian farmers struggled for survival, British investors reaped guaranteed profits from projects tied to Indian infrastructure development. The railways, often touted as a gift from Britain to India, were constructed using British capital under contracts that assured investors a 5% annual return backed by Indian tax revenues. Should these railways fail to generate adequate profits, any shortfall would be made up by Indian taxpayers. Thus, while the risks associated with these ventures fell squarely on India's shoulders, the rewards accrued solely to Britain. This relationship exemplified colonial finance, a system where profits were privatized while costs were socialized among those who had little choice but to bear them. Even after the dissolution of the East India Company, its underlying principles endured within the fabric of imperial governance. London financiers recognized that outright conquest was unnecessary for profiting from foreign lands. All they required was control over credit systems and economic levers. By manipulating financial structures and leveraging local resources for their gain, they ensured that colonial exploitation continued unabated long after formal rule had ended. The empire has taken on its final shape: debt. Following its independence in 1947, India inherited not only a legacy of poverty, but also a system of dependence that had been entrenched for centuries. The relentless extraction of resources over hundreds of years devastated local industries, obliterated capital reserves, and left the nation grappling with a literacy rate below 2% alongside chronic hunger. However, the world into which India entered was far from liberated. It was economically globalized, structured upon principles that mirrored those first introduced by empires: trade imbalances, capital flows, and invisible extractions. Newly independent developing nations found themselves ensnared in a familiar trap. They exported raw materials while importing finished goods and took on foreign currency loans to finance these purchases. Does this sound familiar? It is the very framework that drained India's resources for 2 centuries, now repackaged for the 20th century. In contemporary times, this mechanism has adopted new terminology. It's referred to as debt dependency or structural adjustment. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank do not wield muskets or command armies. Instead, they operate through conditional loans, austerity programs, and trade regulations that often yield similar results. Wealth continues to flow from the impoverished to the affluent, cloaked in the guise of policy. Each year, developing nations collectively remit interest and profits amounting to more than $200 billion to wealthy economies, far exceeding the aid they receive in return. The direction of this outflow remains unchanged. It has merely transitioned into digital transactions. The empire may have fallen, but spreadsheets continue to function effectively. This encapsulates the quiet truth of global economics. Capitalism is essentially modeled after imperial structures. The same logic behind resource extraction persists, now executed in a cleaner, quieter, and less visible manner. As Britain industrialized, it exploited Indian resources, labor forces, and revenues. In contrast, when modern nations pursue industrialization today, they frequently rely on outsourced labor, external debts, and offshore profits. Different eras, yet an identical imbalance persists. The lesson is stark and thoroughly relevant today. Empires do not simply fade away. They evolve over time. They transition from territorial conquests to accounting ledgers, from gunpowder-led invasions to contractual agreements, from outright domination to subtle subjugation. India's narrative serves as one of the most compelling illustrations of this evolution. What Britain established in India transcended mere colonial governance. It was a prototype for what we recognize as the modern global economy, a system wherein value is surreptitiously elevated through mechanisms of credit systems, trading practices, and taxation policies. This intricate web binds nations in cycles of dependency that are often overlooked yet profoundly impactful. India maintained a favorable trade balance with virtually every nation. Gold and silver poured into the subcontinent rather than flowing outwards. Yet beyond these shores loomed an ambitious island nation, armed and organized around a groundbreaking concept: joint stock companies. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a consortium of London merchants known as the East India Company. While it was not initially a governing body, it soon evolved into one wielding substantial influence over its operations. Thus emerges an urgent inquiry into how these historical patterns continue to shape our present realities. The mechanisms of wealth extraction remain alarmingly consistent across different epochs and political landscapes. Understanding this continuity allows for critical reflections on contemporary economic practices and their implications for equity and justice on a global scale. Raj was the world's first experiment with a free market, yet only one side enjoyed true freedom. Even in contemporary discussions about globalization, we frequently overlook its origins, rooted deeply in a network of resource extraction. Ships that once transported silk and spices have now become vessels for capital, while banks that financed empires have shifted focus to funding development projects. Despite this evolution, profits still flow in the same direction as they always have. Yet, India has shown remarkable resilience. After enduring 2 centuries of plunder, famine, and strife, it has managed to rise again. The country undertook the nationalization of its industries, reformed its currency system, and began reclaiming what had been taken, not out of vengeance, but through thoughtful reimagining of its future. Today, India stands as one of the fastest-growing economies on the globe. However, the scars from its tumultuous past remain visible. The wealth gap between the global north and south mirrors historical patterns established long ago. Old trade routes solidified into channels of capital flow. This reality raises a profound question that confronts every generation. When a system rewards extraction over creation, can it ever truly be considered free? Ultimately, The British Empire demonstrated not only that empires can crumble but also that they can adapt and morph over time. India has proven that even nations subjected to the harshest exploitation can rise from their ashes. Nevertheless, recovery is a slow process. Extraction occurs instantaneously, while restoration demands patience and effort, a stark arithmetic of imperialism. The British did not merely conquer India through military might. They subjugated it with ledgers and accounting practices. The financial records initiated in 1757 continue to dictate balances today, albeit under different names and utilizing modern tools. History may not repeat itself verbatim, but the echoes of past balances resonate within contemporary economic structures. If this perspective offers you new insights into our shared history's complexities, contemplate where these lessons lead us next. History possesses answers waiting to be uncovered. It is merely a matter of seeking out the right paths to explore. At first glance, this company appeared merely as another trader vying for space in an already crowded market alongside Portuguese, Dutch, and French competitors who had established their own footholds in India. However, instead of seeking partnerships like others did, the British sought to establish an ironclad monopoly over trade routes and resources. As they navigated these complex waters filled with rival interests and local dynamics, their ambitions only grew bolder, laying down foundations for control that would last for generations to come. With shrewd negotiations and strategic alliances alongside calculated military actions when necessary, they began weaving themselves into India's economic fabric in ways that would reshape its destiny forevermore. Their secret weapon was not diplomacy or military might, but rather the power of finance. They operated ships funded through bonds, secured by Lloyd's Insurance, and leveraged a London-based credit network that enabled them to expand their trade like no empire had done before. The company soon realized that real profits were derived not from trading goods but from taxation. In the year 1757, everything changed dramatically. The Battle of Plassey, a seemingly minor conflict in Bengal, marked a pivotal moment in global history. With fewer than 1,000 British soldiers and a handful of local allies, the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. However, the true victory emerged later. The company installed a puppet ruler, effectively granting itself the authority to collect taxes within Bengal. This decision heralded the dawn of corporate colonialism. Over the next decade, the company extracted tens of millions of pounds sterling annually from Bengal, an extraction so extensive that it triggered inflation, famine, and financial collapse throughout the region. While London thrived on this influx of wealth, Calcutta suffered through deprivation and hunger.